Hello and welcome to our second little mini lecture on environmental policy. In this one, we are talking a little bit more about the GEF hypothesis and particularly the area of fairness. So to review, the GEF hypothesis, or the Greed Efficiency Fairness hypothesis by Wilke, talks about how we balance issues of personal benefit or selfishness, collective benefit or common good, and perceived fairness of implementation. So last time we talked about uh, the personal individual policy outcomes side of things, the motivators and what do we target in terms of behavior change. And we also talked about the collective benefits in the collective policy outcomes and trying to determine uh, recognizing that there are some usually personal benefits to collective change, but needing to get people on board with identifying and awareness and concern about the issue, and that the acceptance of the collective benefit usually comes later when the benefit gets realized. So this third part is talking about the fairness of implementation, the role that the process follows in terms of balancing out personal and collective benefits. So when we talk about fairness, we typically talk about three main types. Most of the time we spend time talking in psychology classes about distributive justice, that is, rewards and punishments and how those are applied in a fair way. Uh, but even if we don't have distributive justice, a second option, say, even if I'm not getting paid what I think is fair, as long as everybody is being treated in the same way or that fair procedures are being followed, that's procedural justice. The idea of process being fair. And then the third type, interactional justice, deals with relationships, and we'll be talking about several aspects of that as well. So one of the first aspects of justice and fairness that we have to consider is intrapersonal justice, to say, am I being treated fairly? To what degree do I feel like I am being treated fairly? Do I benefit? How do I compare to some internal standard of value? That sort of, am I better off now than I was before? When something has changed, am I improved? So this idea of, as I look at uh, who is better off now than they were 4 years ago. Here's a blog uh, that is on the conservative side of things, right? To say, am I happier now? Am I more fed now? Do I make more money now? How do I survive? And is my situation good, right? So intrapersonal justice is that sense of my own personal justice. Do I feel like things are fair? So once I think about my own sense of self and my sense of fairness with myself, then I look at other people. How do my benefits relate to the benefits that other people are receiving? So who else is benefiting from a change? Typically, we talk about two different forms of judgment on interpersonal justice. One is equality, the other is equity. Now, those are very similar words, but they have very different meanings. So equality is basically this idea of everybody being affected the same. Um, the idea that, as we see here, everybody gets the same size box, regardless of their height. So everybody is affected by the policy in the same way. This leads in environmental standpoints to the NIMBY rule, N-I-M-B-Y, not in my backyard, to say I'm perfectly okay with nuclear power as long as it's not in my neighborhood, right? And not something that I have to worry about risk. Equity, on the other hand, as we see in this diagram as well, is that fairness is relative based on some need or based on use. Uh, this idea of uh, relative fairness compared to other people. Some issues of NIMBY or equality, we see here some political cartoons, one about Wind power, right? People like wind power. Some people think they're pretty as long as I don't have to live next to them or have to deal with the traffic associated with them or those sorts of things. NIMBY cows, right? That I think it's important to have farms. I just don't want the pig lot across from my house and lowering my property values. Everybody has their issue of how other people's stuff is interfering with their business. So when we talk about equity, equity is talking about relative fairness. That is, different people get different levels of reward that's based on some sort of need or use, right? People get paid based on their contribution to the group. People get rewarded based on who needs it more or who has put in more effort or who uses it more often. So we talk about equity being horizontal or vertical. Horizontal equity is where we reward people based on their contribution. So if people work hard, they should get paid more. If people are using something, they should get paid for it. If somebody is misusing a resource and you have to replace it, why should I have to pay for somebody a penalty that really belongs with someone else? Vertical equity deals with proportion to need and ability. The idea that people who have more money should pay more taxes. The idea that who has the capacity to pay, who is capable of shouldering the burden for this particular thing. So vertical equity would be basing it based on ability to pay rather than how much needs to get paid. A third way to think about equity and justice is what we call intergenerational justice. Not just how does this benefit me or my neighbor, but how does this benefit down the road? And so when we talk about environmental justice, we really are talking about how our costs and benefits today affect the costs and benefits of our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. So the idea of legacy, right? The idea of justice in the long term, sustainability in the long term, where it's not benefiting me directly, but it is benefiting people who will follow after me. Here's some other graphs related to climate change and contributions to various sorts of things, right? Where do we spend our money? Who is responsible? When we start talking about environmental change, right, we have the local individuals, we have the corporate folks and their contributions and benefits. But when we talk about things like water or air, as opposed to mining, right, or when we talk about oil or those sorts of global resources, we start figuring out who has responsibility, right? When another country is polluting or not conserving or whatever, how does that affect me? How does that affect my country when air quality somewhere else affects air quality for me, even though I'm doing the right thing? And how does that affect down the road, right? How does America's energy consumption affect third world countries that otherwise aren't going to be receiving costs or benefits down the road? A third type of justice is procedural justice. So procedural justice is taking into account how the decision was made and how the decision was implemented, how the changes were put into place. So this is taking into account who was involved or consulted before the decision was made. Do people have opportunity to comment? Are the public represented on the committees or having a chance to look at the plans? Or what role do people have in having information that changes are possible or what changes might occur? Do they have the opportunity to respond and have input? Part of the procedural justice also deals with issues of trust. That is, trust about completion or follow through on commitments. If somebody says they're going to do something, do you think that they actually will? If a company says they'll pay for any damages, what happens when the company closes before the damages are solved? So issues of trust, issues of communication, and issues of consistency to see how is it implemented. Is it implemented fairly across time, across sectors? And so when we look at issues of racism or sexism or ageism or other forms of bias and discrimination, those would be violations of procedural justice in many cases. So we see here inappropriateness of process, the issue of consistency, bias and discrimination, accuracy. Is it based on good data? Is everybody who has an important voice represented? Is there an opportunity to fix errors in the way as things are happening? And what are the norms of professional conduct? That is everybody behaving in a right and ethical way?